"We're going tomorrow, Mom. I've sold your beach house." The words landed softly, almost politely, yet they struck me harder than any shout ever could, because my son Daniel said them while standing in my kitchen, holding a paper cup of coffee like this was an ordinary morning conversation, like he hadn't just taken something from me that held 30 years of my life inside its walls. For a few seconds I just stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came, the joke that would make me laugh and call him cruel for teasing an old woman before breakfast, but instead he met my eyes calmly, confidently, the way people do when they've already decided something for you and see no reason to ask permission. The beach house wasn't just a house, it was where my late husband built a crooked bookshelf with his own hands, where my children learned to swim, where every window carried the sound of the ocean and every corner smelled faintly of salt and sunscreen. And even though I hadn't been there in years, knowing it existed felt like knowing a piece of my heart was still breathing somewhere. I asked Daniel what he meant, even though I already understood, and he sighed like I was being difficult, explaining that he had power of attorney, that the taxes were piling up, that I was getting older and didn't need the responsibility, and that the buyer had offered cash, no delays, no complications. His words were smooth, rehearsed, as if he'd practiced them in front of a mirror until they sounded reasonable enough to silence my objections. I wanted to yell, to ask how he could sell something that wasn't his, but my throat tightened instead, filling with questions I didn't yet know how to ask, because beneath the shock was a deeper fear, one that whispered that maybe I had trusted him too much simply because he was my son. I remember sitting down at the table slowly, my knees suddenly weak, while Daniel continued talking about logistics, moving timelines, and how this would make things easier for me, and that's when I noticed he avoided mentioning the buyer's name. He said the buyer again and again, like the identity didn't matter, like it was just another stranger passing through my life to take something from it. I asked him directly who bought it, and for the first time his confidence cracked just slightly, enough for me to notice, enough to make my heart beat faster. And after a pause that felt longer than it should have, he said the name quietly, like a confession, Harold Whitman. The name stirred something deep inside me, something old and unsettled, because Harold Whitman wasn't just anyone. He was a man I hadn't heard from in over 40 years, a man who had known my husband before I did, back when secrets were easier to hide and promises were made without witnesses. Daniel must have seen the color drain from my face because he quickly added that it didn't matter, that it was ancient history. But history has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it, and suddenly I was 25 again, standing on a windy beach while my husband argued quietly with a man I barely knew, their voices low and urgent, stopping abruptly when they noticed me watching. I had asked later who that man was, and my husband had brushed it off with a smile, calling him an old business acquaintance, nothing more. But now that name echoed in my ears with a weight I couldn't ignore. I asked Daniel how he even found this man, and he admitted that Harold had approached him first, claiming he'd been waiting for the right time to reclaim the property, words that sent a chill down my spine because they suggested something unfinished, something unresolved, something that had never truly belonged to me in the first place. As Daniel gathered his papers and prepared to leave, telling me we'd drive down together in the morning to finalize everything, I realized that this wasn't just about a house, it was about control, about decisions being made over my head because people assumed I was too old, too tired, too emotional to understand what was best for me. After he left, I sat alone in the quiet kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock, and for the first time since my husband's death, I felt a sharp anger cut through the grief, not at Daniel alone, but at myself for letting my life shrink so much that others felt entitled to manage it without asking. I pulled out an old photo album that afternoon, flipping through pages of smiling faces and sun-bleached memories, stopping on a picture of my husband standing proudly on the porch of the beach house, arm around my shoulders, his smile full of promises I believed would last forever. And I wondered what else he had kept from me, what deals he had made quietly, and whether the house had ever truly been mine at all. That night I barely slept, my mind circling questions that refused to settle, and by morning I knew one thing with certainty. Before I let anyone sell my past and decide my future, I needed to face the truth myself, no matter how painful it might be, because some lessons only come when you stop being silent and start asking the questions you were once afraid to ask.
By the time we got into the car the next morning, the sky was still pale and undecided, that soft gray-blue color that feels like the world hasn't fully woken up yet. And I noticed how Daniel drove without saying much, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a way that reminded me of his father whenever he thought he was doing the right thing but knew someone might challenge him. The silence between us wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, thick with words neither of us wanted to say. And as the miles rolled by, I realized this drive wasn't just taking us to a beach house. It was carrying us straight into a past I had ignored for decades. I broke the silence by asking Daniel again why he felt the need to act without my consent, and he answered in the careful tone people use when they believe they're being kind by taking control, telling me he was worried about my finances, my health, my future, as if love automatically gave him the right to decide those things for me. And although I understood his concern, something inside me resisted fiercely, because concern without respect can feel dangerously close to betrayal. As the ocean came into view, shimmering faintly through the morning haze, my chest tightened, not with joy, but with a strange sense of dread, because I knew that whatever truth waited for me there would change how I remembered my life. When we finally pulled into the familiar driveway, the house looked exactly the same and completely different at once, like an old friend you haven't seen in years. Same shape, same presence, but carrying an invisible distance between who you were then and who you are now. The porch boards creaked under my feet as I stepped out of the car, the salty air filling my lungs with memories I hadn't invited back. And that's when I saw him standing near the railing, older, thinner, his hair almost entirely gray, but unmistakably the same man from that long ago afternoon, Harold Whitman. He turned slowly when he heard us, and for a moment none of us spoke, the sound of waves crashing below filling the space where conversation should have been. And then he nodded politely, as if we were meeting for the first time, though his eyes told a different story, one heavy with recognition and restraint. "I was hoping you'd come," he said quietly, looking directly at me, not Daniel, and something in his voice suggested he had been waiting for this moment far longer than I realized. I asked him why he bought the house, and he answered honestly, without defensiveness, saying that it had always been part of an unfinished chapter, something tied to promises made long before I ever stepped into the picture. And though his words were vague, they carried enough weight to confirm my fear that the house wasn't just a home, it was collateral in a story I had never been told. We sat on the porch, the three of us, separated by years of silence and misunderstanding, and Harold began to talk, slowly at first, choosing his words with care, explaining that he and my husband had been business partners in their early 20s, full of ambition and reckless confidence, investing in coastal developments before they truly understood the risks. One deal had gone disastrously wrong, leaving them buried in debt and legal threats, and in desperation they made an agreement. My husband would walk away, start fresh, and in return he would keep the beach house under his name, quietly holding it until the debt could be repaid. But life moved on, marriages happened, children were born, and the debt was never fully settled, only buried under years of silence and denial. I felt my heart pounding as Harold spoke, each sentence reshaping my memories, making me question moments I once thought were simple, innocent. And as he continued, I realized this wasn't a story of greed, it was a story of fear, of young men making desperate choices and older men living with the consequences. Harold admitted he had stayed away intentionally, believing my husband would one day tell me the truth, believing that time would somehow soften the blow. But when my husband died suddenly, that conversation never happened, leaving Harold with a moral debt of his own. He said he waited years before approaching Daniel, not wanting to disturb my grief, but when property taxes rose and legal records resurfaced, he knew the matter could no longer be ignored, so he did the only thing he felt would resolve it cleanly. He bought the house outright. I wanted to scream, to accuse him of stealing my life piece by piece, but as I looked at his weathered face, lined with regret rather than triumph, my anger faltered, replaced by a deep exhaustion that came from realizing how many people had been carrying this secret in different ways, each convinced they were protecting someone else. I turned to Daniel, who stared at the floor, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet discomfort, and for the first time I saw him not as a son making decisions for me, but as a man caught between responsibility and fear, trying to fix something broken long before he understood it. Standing there, with the sound of the ocean wrapping around us like a witness that had seen everything and forgotten nothing, I understood that the house was never just about ownership. It was about unresolved truth, about the cost of silence, and about how easily love can become entangled with control when people stop communicating. I asked Harold one final question, the one that mattered most, why he was telling me all this now, and he answered simply, because you deserved to know the truth while you were still here to hear it. As the sun climbed higher and cast sharp shadows across the porch, I realized I was standing at a crossroads, not between keeping or losing a house, but between holding on to a version of my past built on half-truths, or accepting a reality that, while painful, finally made sense. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next would not be decided for me again. I would decide it myself.
I stayed behind on the porch after Daniel walked toward the shoreline to clear his head, the old wooden boards warm beneath my hands as I sat there alone with my thoughts, listening to the steady rhythm of the waves that once sounded like comfort, but now felt like a reminder of how long the truth had been moving beneath the surface without my knowledge. I thought about my marriage, about all the nights I had trusted the man sleeping beside me, believing we shared everything worth sharing, and I wondered whether secrets kept out of fear still counted as lies, or if time somehow softened their weight, because even though my husband was gone, the impact of what he hid was still very much alive. Harold remained nearby, giving me space but not leaving, and after a long silence he spoke again, telling me he hadn't come to take anything from me, that he never wanted the house for profit or power, only closure. And though I wanted to dismiss his words, something in his tone, quiet, almost ashamed, made me listen. He explained that after my husband died, he discovered documents proving the original agreement between them had never expired, legally giving him a claim he could have enforced through the courts. But he chose not to, because dragging me into lawsuits would have been cruel, and instead he waited, believing the right moment would come when the truth could be faced directly. As he spoke, I felt a strange mixture of resentment and gratitude, resenting the fact that my life had been shaped by decisions I didn't consent to, yet grateful that at least now, finally, someone was choosing honesty over convenience. When Daniel returned, his eyes red from staring too long at the water, I realized he had been carrying guilt of his own, guilt for acting without my permission, and guilt for discovering that his father, the man he admired, had been more complicated than he ever imagined. I asked Daniel why he hadn't told me everything as soon as he learned the truth, and he admitted that he was afraid it would break me, afraid it would tarnish my memory of his father, afraid that confronting the past would do more harm than good. He said he thought selling the house quietly would spare me pain, And that's when I understood something important. People often confuse protection with control and love with authority, not realizing that withholding truth can hurt just as deeply as revealing it. I told him that I didn't need to be protected from my own life, that what hurt the most wasn't the secret itself, but the feeling of being excluded from decisions about my own story. That afternoon, I asked to walk through the house one last time, and Harold agreed without hesitation, handing me the keys as if returning something borrowed rather than claimed. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight filtering through the windows, and every room felt like a memory frozen in place, untouched and waiting, as if time itself had paused out of respect for what had once been there. I moved slowly, tracing my fingers along the walls, stopping in the kitchen where laughter once filled the air, and in the bedroom where my husband and I planned futures that never fully arrived. And instead of sadness, I felt clarity settling in, because for the first time I was seeing this house not as a symbol of loss, but as a chapter that had run its course. Standing in the living room, I realized that holding on to the house had become my way of holding on to an illusion, that my life had been simple, honest, and complete. But life is rarely that neat, and understanding that didn't cheapen my memories, it gave them context. I returned to the porch and told Harold that I accepted the sale, not because I was forced to, but because I chose to let go, and the relief on his face told me this decision mattered more than the legal transaction ever could. I then turned to Daniel and told him something he hadn't expected to hear. I forgave him, but forgiveness didn't erase responsibility, and trust would need to be rebuilt, not assumed. As we prepared to leave, I asked Harold one final favor, not for money or apologies, but for the truth, in full, and he nodded, promising to send me copies of every document, every agreement, every piece of the past I had the right to understand. Driving away from the beach house, I watched it disappear in the rearview mirror, not with heartbreak, but with acceptance, because sometimes closure doesn't come from keeping what you love, but from understanding why you're ready to let it go. That evening, back in my quiet home, I sat alone with a cup of tea, thinking about how easily years can pass without questioning the foundations of our lives, and how courage doesn't always look like confrontation. It can look like listening, like accepting uncomfortable truths, and like choosing growth over nostalgia. I knew then that this experience wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where my voice mattered again, where my choices were my own, and where honesty, no matter how late it arrives, would always be worth facing. The days after we returned from the coast moved more slowly than I expected, as if my mind was trying to catch up with everything my heart had already processed, and I found myself replaying conversations in my head, not just the ones from that weekend, but years of small moments that now carried new meaning. My husband's sudden silences when money came up, his reluctance to talk about the beach house in detail, the way he always changed the subject when I suggested selling it earlier. None of it felt like betrayal anymore, but it did feel like avoidance, and I began to understand how fear, when left unspoken, can quietly shape an entire life. Daniel started calling more often, his voice cautious, almost unsure of his place, and I could hear in his pauses that he was learning how to speak to me not as someone fragile, but as someone capable of making her own decisions. One afternoon, he came over with a stack of papers Harold had sent, neatly organized and carefully labeled, and we sat at the dining table going through them together, line by line, not rushing, not arguing, just reading. And with every document, I felt a strange sense of relief, because truth, even when it's heavy, has a way of grounding you. It gives you something solid to stand on. As we read, it became clear that my husband never intended for the secret to last forever, that there were drafts of letters he never sent, notes he never finished, evidence of a man wrestling with guilt but unable to find the right moment to speak. And instead of anger, I felt compassion, because life rarely offers a perfect time for difficult conversations, and waiting for one can mean waiting forever. Daniel admitted that seeing those papers changed how he viewed his father, not lowering him from a pedestal, but humanizing him. And in that shared understanding, something between us began to heal, not through grand apologies, but through quiet honesty. Weeks passed, and I noticed a subtle shift in myself, a lightness I hadn't felt in years, as if releasing the house had also released me from a long-held tension I didn't know I was carrying. I began to declutter my home, not in a rushed or emotional way, but thoughtfully, choosing what to keep based on meaning rather than havoc. And with every box I sorted through, I realized how much of my identity had been tied to preserving the past rather than living in the present. One morning, while donating old clothes, I caught my reflection in the mirror and saw not a woman defined by what she'd lost, but one shaped by what she had survived. Harold wrote to me as promised, not with excuses or justifications, but with clarity, explaining his perspective, acknowledging the harm caused by years of silence, and thanking me for listening, even when I didn't owe him that grace. His letter ended with something that stayed with me, that closure doesn't come from erasing the past, but from understanding it fully, and I realized that this experience, painful as it was, had given me something valuable: agency. For the first time in a long while, my life felt like it belonged to me again, not to memory, not to fear, and not to decisions made on my behalf. Daniel and I began to rebuild trust in small ways: weekly dinners, honest conversations, laughter that didn't feel forced, and I made it clear that while I appreciated his concern, my independence wasn't negotiable. He listened, truly listened, and I could see him learning that respect doesn't diminish love, it strengthens it. One evening, as we washed dishes together, he asked me what I wanted to do next, not what I should do, and that simple question felt like a turning point because it acknowledged my right to choose my own path. I told him I wanted to travel, not to escape, but to explore, to experience life without the weight of unspoken truths, and he smiled, not with worry, but with pride, and offered to help me plan my first trip. As I lay in bed that night thinking about the future, I realized that the real inheritance my husband left me wasn't the house or the memories, but the lesson that silence has a cost, and that courage, even when it comes late, is always worth the risk. The beach house was gone, but what remained was something far more important: a renewed sense of self, a deeper understanding of love's complexities, and the knowledge that even in the later chapters of life, growth is possible, change is powerful, and truth, no matter how delayed, has the ability to set us free.
As summer slowly gave way to early fall, I found myself waking each morning with a quiet sense of intention, no longer weighed down by the unspoken questions that had followed me for years, and it surprised me how much emotional space had been freed by simply knowing the truth. I began to notice details I had once overlooked: the way sunlight pooled on the kitchen floor in the late afternoon, the comfort of my own routines, the peace that came from not having to preserve an illusion, and with that awareness came a renewed curiosity about who I was beyond the roles I had played for so long. Widow, mother, caretaker, those titles still mattered, but they no longer defined the limits of my life. One afternoon, I received a call from an attorney Harold had recommended, explaining that there was a remaining financial matter tied to the beach house, not a dispute, but an opportunity, because when the property sold, there was a surplus after the old debt was resolved, and legally, a portion of that money belonged to me.
My first instinct was to refuse it, to distance myself from anything connected to that chapter, but after thinking carefully, I realized that accepting it wasn't about greed, it was about acknowledgement, about recognizing that my years of ownership, maintenance, and emotional investment had value. I agreed to accept the funds, not as compensation for loss, but as a step toward honoring my own worth. When the check arrived, I sat with it for a long time before depositing it, reflecting on how money, much like truth, carries meaning beyond numbers, and I decided to use it not to replace what was gone, but to build something new. I set aside a portion for travel, another for a small emergency fund to ensure my independence, and the rest I donated to a local community center that helped older women learn financial literacy, because I understood firsthand how easily knowledge can be withheld in the name of protection, and how empowering access to information can be at any stage of life. Daniel noticed the change in me almost immediately, not in dramatic gestures, but in confidence, in the way I spoke about my plans without seeking approval. And one evening he told me that watching me reclaim my autonomy had taught him more about adulthood than anything else ever had. Hearing that mattered more than any apology, because it meant the lesson had landed, not just emotionally, but practically, and I felt proud knowing that growth in one generation could ripple into the next. As I prepared for my first solo trip, a modest journey to a quiet coastal town not unlike the one I had left behind, I reflected on how fear had once convinced me that stability meant staying still, when in reality, stability comes from trusting yourself enough to move forward. Packing my suitcase, I found an old photograph of my husband and me at the beach, smiling without knowing what lay ahead. And instead of sadness, I felt gratitude, because love, even when imperfect, leaves behind moments worth cherishing. And understanding the truth didn't erase those moments, it gave them honesty. During my travels, I met people who shared their own stories of delayed truths and unexpected awakenings, and I realized how universal my experience really was, how many lives are shaped by silence passed down through generations, and how powerful it can be when someone finally chooses to speak. Sitting on a bench overlooking the water one evening, I thought about the beach house, not as something taken from me, but as a teacher, a catalyst that forced me to confront realities I had avoided, and in doing so gave me permission to live more fully. When I returned home, I felt lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because I trusted myself to handle whatever came next. I had learned that love doesn't require blindness, that family doesn't mean surrendering agency, and that age does not disqualify anyone from growth, courage, or reinvention. The house was gone, but the lesson remained, etched into my life with clarity and purpose. The morning I realized how much had truly changed came quietly, without announcements or dramatic revelations, as most real transformations do, when I caught myself making plans without fear, without asking permission from ghosts of the past, or even from the people who loved me. It wasn't that my life had suddenly become perfect, but it had become honest. And honesty, I learned, has a steadying power that nothing else can replace. I thought back to the day Daniel told me the house was sold, how small and displaced I felt in that moment, and I understood now that what hurt most wasn't losing the house, it was losing my voice, even temporarily, and reclaiming it had been the real victory all along. Daniel and I settled into a new rhythm, one built on conversation rather than assumption, and there was a noticeable shift in how he approached decisions, not just with me, but in his own life, because once you witness the cost of silence, you begin to value transparency everywhere. He apologized again one evening, not out of guilt but understanding, saying he finally grasped that love doesn't give anyone the right to decide another person's fate, and hearing that told me the lesson had reached its deepest place. I reminded him that forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's choosing not to let the past dictate the future, and we both agreed that what mattered now was how we moved forward. As time passed, the beach house faded into memory, no longer sharp with emotion, but softened by perspective, and I realized that some losses aren't meant to be replaced, only understood. What surprised me most was how many people, after hearing my story, shared their own. Friends, neighbors, even strangers, each carrying some version of a truth withheld, a choice made on their behalf. And I saw clearly then how common it is for people, especially women of my generation, to be protected right out of their own lives. The realization didn't make me bitter, it made me determined. I began speaking at the community center where I had donated part of the settlement, not as an expert, but as someone who had lived the consequences of silence, encouraging others to ask questions, to demand clarity, and to remember that independence doesn't expire with age. The conversations that followed were raw and honest, and each one reinforced what I had come to believe, that dignity comes from being included in your own story, even when the truth is difficult. One evening, sitting alone on my porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, I reflected on my husband with a tenderness that no longer felt conflicted. He was flawed, fearful, loving, and human, and understanding his choices didn't excuse them, but it allowed me to release resentment I didn't realize I still carried. I realized that people don't hide the truth because they're cruel. Most hide it because they're afraid of what honesty might cost, never realizing that silence often costs more. The lesson I carried forward was simple but profound. Speak while you can, listen while you're able, and never confuse control with care. Life doesn't require us to have all the answers, but it does require us to respect one another's right to know the truth and to choose what to do with it. Losing the house taught me that security built on omission is fragile, but self-trust built on truth is unshakable. If there's one thing I hope my story leaves behind, it's this. No matter your age, your role, or your past, your voice matters, your consent matters, and your life deserves honesty. Don't wait for someone else to decide what you can handle, because you may be stronger than they ever imagined. And if stories like this resonate with you, stories about real life, real mistakes, and real growth, subscribe for more videos that remind us all how powerful truth can be.